There is an irony in Stevie Wonder's story that hurts too much to be coincidence. The child who could not see the faces of the people he loved, who reached toward voices in the dark, trying to build a map of the world through sound and touch alone. The teenager who discovered that music was not compensation for blindness, but a second sight entirely, a way of perceiving emotional truths that sighted people walked past every day without noticing. The icon who built entire universes inside compositions like Isn't She Lovely and A's, painting colors into chords and landscapes into lyrics with a precision that left music critics reaching desperately for new vocabulary. All of that, so that life would eventually arrive and ask him whether he could survive loss, obscurity, and the particular cruelty of a world that consumes its legends while they are still breathing. How does a child born into blindness and poverty become the most visionary artist of his generation? What lived behind the famous smile, behind the trademark rocking motion, behind the joy that seemed so effortless it almost felt unfair? What happens when the very sensitivity that made him extraordinary, that raw, unfiltered access to human feeling, becomes the wound that threatens to undo everything he built? And what does it cost a man to carry the weight of being called a genius before he is old enough to understand what that word will demand from him for the rest of his life? To understand all of that, we need to go back to the beginning, to Saginaw, Michigan, to May 13th, 1950, and to a boy who learned, in the cruelest way possible, that the world reveals its deepest truths only to those forced to feel for them in the dark. Saginaw in 1950 was a city of factory smoke and frozen winters, of streets that promised honest work but rarely promised anything more. It was the kind of place where ambition was considered a luxury, where survival required a specific and relentless focus, and where extraordinary children were born every generation without the world ever knowing. Stevie Hardaway Judkins arrived there on that May morning, 6 weeks premature, small enough to disappear inside the fragile hope of a hospital incubator, small enough that the nurses spoke in careful, lowered voices around him. His mother, Lula Mae Hardaway, was 21 years old and alone, in the way that only young mothers in desperate circumstances understand loneliness. His father, Calvin Judkins, was largely absent, a shadow at the edge of the family's story rather than a presence within it. Lula Mae would eventually move her children to Detroit, chasing the slightly larger promise that a bigger city sometimes offers people with no other options. She worked. She prayed. She held the family together with the particular strength of women who have no alternative to strength. There was no luxury, no industry connections, no paved road to anywhere exceptional. But there was a child who felt the world too intensely for ordinary life to ever contain him. The blindness came from the incubator itself. Too much oxygen pumped into the chamber that kept premature Steveland alive destroyed the tissue of his retinas in a process called retinopathy of prematurity. It was a medical decision made in desperation, the kind of impossible choice that leaves no one to blame and everyone to grieve quietly for the rest of their lives. The result was permanent, total, irreversible. He would never see light, never distinguish shape from shadow, never navigate the visual world that everyone around him accepted as simply the default condition of being alive. In school, the blindness made him a target with the casual cruelty that children deploy without fully calculating the damage they leave behind. He was the different one, the one teachers weren't always certain how to reach, the one other kids circled with a combination of fascination and contempt that difference tends to generate in the young and the frightened. He learned early that need could be weaponized by those watching closely for it. Years later, he would say with a quietness that carried enormous weight, just because a man lacks the use of his eyes doesn't mean he lacks vision. But as a child in Detroit, before the music found him, before Jamie Foxx would one day call him a living god of sound, before the whole world would argue about his mortality in viral search queries, vision was precisely what felt most absent. At age 7, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, just a small, accidental collision between a hurting child and an instrument that had no interest in what he could or could not see. A neighbor gave Stevie a harmonica. It was nothing expensive, nothing special, just a cheap metal instrument that most children would have lost interest in within days. But Stevie held it like a lifeline. He played it until his lips cracked. He played it until the neighbors complained. He played it until his mother understood, with the quiet certainty that mothers sometimes possess, that this was not a phase. By age 9, he had taught himself piano by ear. By age 10, drums. By 11, he was performing with a polish that made adults uncomfortable, because genius in a child always carries something slightly unsettling about it. A family friend connected him with Ronnie White of the Miracles, and Ronnie brought him to Berry Gordy at Motown Records. The audition lasted minutes. The decision lasted seconds. Berry Gordy signed him immediately and renamed him Little Stevie Wonder. He was 11 years old. He had never seen a contract. He had never seen Berry Gordy's face, but he had heard opportunity, and he understood that this sound was different from all the others. And when Stevie played for the first time in that Motown studio, something extraordinary happened. The blindness that had made him an outsider in school, that had marked him as vulnerable and limited, simply vanished behind the music. On stage, behind a microphone, he was not the blind boy who needed accommodation. He was the most electric presence in the room. The stutter of self-consciousness disappeared. The hesitation evaporated. Only the music remained, pure and undeniable, pouring out of him like it had been waiting his entire short life to finally escape. In 1963, at just 13 years old, Fingertips Part 2 hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It made Stevie Wonder the youngest artist ever to top that chart. The child who could not see a single face in the audience had captured the attention of an entire nation simply by feeling what they needed before they knew they needed it. Motown called him a wonder. The press called him a miracle. But Stevie knew something they did not. He knew that the music was not separate from the blindness. The music existed because of the blindness. The darkness had taught him to listen with a depth that sighted people rarely achieve, and now that listening had become his superpower. The years that followed were an avalanche of brilliance that still defies proper explanation. Superstition in 1972. You Are the Sunshine of My Life. Living for the City. Higher Ground. Albums like Inner Visions and Songs in the Key of Life that critics compared to the work of Bach and Beethoven without any sense of hyperbole. 25 Grammy Awards. Over 100 million records sold. Songs that would be sung at weddings, funerals, protests, and presidential inaugurations for the next half-century. Isn't She Lovely, the song he wrote for his newborn daughter Aisha, became an anthem for fathers everywhere. Its lyrics searched millions of times across generations. But behind the red carpets and the million-dollar contracts, something was beginning to crack. The car accident came in August 1973, a logging truck collision that left Stevie in a coma for 4 days. Doctors were not certain he would survive. When he finally woke, his sense of smell was permanently damaged, another sensory loss for a man who had already lost so much. He would later describe the recovery as a period of profound spiritual transformation, but transformation always carries a price. His first marriage to Sarita Wright lasted only 18 months. His second, to Kai Millard, ended after 11 years and 2 children. The tabloids wrote about custody battles and financial disputes with the characteristic coldness of media entertainment. For the world, it was just another celebrity divorce story. For Stevie, it was the collapse of something he had tried to build with hands that could create symphonies but could not always hold on to the people closest to him. By the 1990s, the industry that had celebrated him began to forget him. Younger artists dominated the charts. His albums sold less. Critics who once compared him to gods now wondered if his best work was behind him. He became a reference point rather than a current event, a legend rather than a force. He would confess years later, "There were moments I felt invisible again, like when I was a child, like the world had moved on." But Stevie Wonder had survived worse things than oblivion. In 2024, as searches flooded the internet asking whether he was still alive, whether he and Michael Jackson were cousins, whether the joy he had given the world had finally ended, Stevie Wonder remained standing. Not as the invincible prodigy of 1963, not as the untouchable genius of the 70s, but as a 74-year-old man who understood that real strength was never about avoiding the fall. It was about getting up every single time the world knocked you down and expecting nothing in return except the chance to keep going. His legacy is not a single song, not the Grammys, not the records. His legacy is the living proof that the darkness we are born into does not determine the light we can create. That limitations are not destinations, but starting points. That somewhere in Saginaw, in Detroit, in every city where children are told what they cannot be, there is always the possibility of another Stevie Wonder learning to hear what the world cannot see. What lesson do you take from his story? How many times have you risen when everyone expected you to stay down? Share your reflections below and subscribe for more stories of those who transformed scars into legends. Because in the end, as Stevie taught us through every note and every wound, just because you cannot see the path does not mean you cannot light the way for everyone else.